Welcome to Spotlight on Schools. We focus on the Rochester City School District. I'm your host, Jim Strauss. This is part two of a program where my guests are Tim Macaluso of City Newspaper and Justin Murphy of the Democrat and Chronicle. We've been talking about Bolgen Vargas and his tenure as superintendent of the Rochester City School District. Last week we talked about two of his major goals, his first goals, which were to deal with the absenteeism in the Rochester City School District and reading at grade level, his goal of having students at third grade reading at grade level by third grade. We also talked about the graduation rate. Today we're going to take a little different focus. We're going to talk about his relations with the teachers union, and also his relationship with administrators and with the Board of Education. Let's start with teacher evaluation and tenure. One of the areas Vargas was brought in to address was the tension between the teachers union and the district, which had gotten worse under the leadership of the previous superintendent, Jean-Claude Brizard. Settling a new teacher contract was accomplished very quickly. Tim, one of the questions you asked Vargas in the interview included this statement, and I quote, "When you first started, there were a number of critics who speculated that you would be a co-superintendent with Rochester Teachers Association President Adam Urbanski," end of quote. In the last few years, much has been written about the evaluation of teachers under the Common Core standards adopted by New York State. A major part of each teacher's APPR, which is Annual Professional Performance Review, would be determined by that teacher's students' test scores, could be up to 50%. Poor student test scores could result in denial of tenure or the eventual termination of tenured teachers. New York is still wrestling with the implementation of these standards. Throughout this period, it seems to me that Vargas has been largely silent about teacher performance, teacher tenure, teacher evaluations. The clearest statement I can find by Vargas on this issue is an argument that Tim wrote, an article rather that Tim wrote in the June 18th City Newspaper entitled Teachers' Rights Challenge. Tim, you wrote this, and I quote, "Vargas believes, however, that tenure has to be earned for doing an exceptional job, that it shouldn't be awarded based on time served or meeting minimum standards. He says that tenure can inhibit the flexibility needed to manage an organization such as a city school district, particularly when it comes to turning around poorly performing schools," end of quote. You quoted him as saying, and I quote again, "I personally do believe we need to revisit tenure and adjust it to meet the needs of the current times," end of quote. Other than that, he doesn't seem to be going after teachers when many others are.
He is not on the bandwagon of teacher bashing. He oftentimes will reference the Rochester City School Districts and say, you know, we can match our teachers to any teachers. And he goes a long way in that. At the same time, and also you were right, in the very beginning, one of his, his early missions was to try and mend that relationship with President Urbanski, as well as the teachers throughout the district, which the morale was pretty low at that point. And so I think he has gone a long way in that direction. At the same time, he does kind of manage to sort of walk this line where he talks about tenure. He does say that tenure has been an issue. He has, as you quoted there, made the comment that, tenure is something to be earned. He doesn't necessarily believe it's something that should be, earned at a specific time, but really it's the reward for that really exceptional work that is expected. At the same time, I think that, there is this, the whole issue of teacher evaluations is just a prickly issue. Mm-hmm. And so I can see on a certain level where he doesn't really want to wade into that. And it's not something that he's going to, I'm not sure that he can win in any kind of conversation about that. It's that difficult of a conversation. Mm-hmm.
Urban superintendents like Bolgen are in a particularly difficult position. For instance, we saw in the testing uproar this spring, all of the 18 suburban superintendents in Monroe County all co-signed a letter to, I guess, the governor saying, we hereby object to the testing regime that's in place in New York. And Dr. Vargas was pretty conspicuous in not signing that, but he also has a lot more at stake with the state than the suburban districts do. He went to Albany with his hat in hand asking for more than $30 million this year. So he's not really in a position to tell them what for. So I think when Tim's talking about a line that he's trying to walk between supporting the teachers union and cozying up to what is perceived as sort of an anti-teacher state administration, he can't run too far afoul of either of those sides.
Okay. One of his justifications for being for the testing, and I was surprised when he came on that side, but you make a perfect case for it. I hadn't thought about that, was that we need the data. We need the data. To say he doesn't address the whole issue of whether Pearson's tests are flawed, which many people believe are.
And there's maybe another reason why it's maybe hard to come down on the teachers on the tenure question is that it's harder now probably to point to a single teacher and use data and say this is or is not a good teacher than it's been in a long time. When the state, I assume right now, is sitting down trying to make heads or tails of the test scores from this spring with the massive refusal numbers, they're going to come up with a number and say, you, Jim Strauss, are a 75 teacher and you're a 74 teacher, and it's not going to make any sense. So in that climate, making those decisions on teacher tenure, or more to the point, refusing teacher tenure, if you were to do that, is harder to have confidence in.
Oh, absolutely. This year's a wash. Everyone says that. It's going forward. What will they do? And there's some major discussions happening. The change in leadership at the top in the state ed department. Everyone's waiting to see what happens. Okay. Well, then, let's move then to the School District's Association of Supervisors and Administrators. Vargas' relationship with principals has been a lot more problematic. Their union, the Association of Supervisors and Administrators, do you say that, is that pronounced ASAR? Is that how they say that?
Yeah.
Okay. Voted no confidence in Bolgen Vargas in January of 2014. Justin, you've written extensively about that conflict. Can you tell us the causes for that strained relationship? Do you remember?
No, I can't.
Okay.
I can't tell you the causes.
Okay. Well, I have written down some things. See if they jar your memory. Well, one of the main ones is that he's denied tenure at a much higher rate than all of the previous four combined. Granting fewer tenures, showing poor leadership, the union claims, and failing to communicate well. Those are the three basic things that they have complained about.
It seems that so often in the district, a lot of these things are personality driven, and it's hard to see where these two conflicting claims, where they meet exactly. These administrators have been very insistent that they would love to follow through on Dr. Vargas's ideas and policies if only they were given more consistent leadership and guidance in doing that. He has taken the idea, and he's been pretty strenuous in stating it to whoever will listen, that the union is tying his hands when it comes to financial savings or giving him the nimbleness that he needs to implement his policies. We were talking before about how difficult it is to get your hands around a bureaucracy of this size, and I think that in his mind, the way to do that is to have as many of those strings in my hand as I can and have fewer intermediaries maybe. So we've seen that in the conflict over at the superintendent's employment group, and I think we see that in his frustration with the administrators union, that he sees maybe is not being sufficiently compliant with what he's trying to do.
Not being sufficiently compliant in what areas?
Well, I think in some of the contractual givebacks that he's hoping for, and that contract has been lapsed for quite a long time now.
Givebacks like concessions on vacation time payouts, that's one of the things that I saw in the argument.
Yeah.
That seems minor, does it not to you?
It does seem minor, but that gets to the point where I think now it's personality driven as much as anything else. Now there's a new ASAR president now, Tim Kleiby, and we'll see if that makes any difference.
Okay. And the payouts were pretty, actually, what he was talking about at one point, an example that he uses where, an employee can have literally months of accumulated vacation. and I think it ran into the millions with the amount of money that was being paid out. Not millions and millions, but I think it was like something like 1.2 or 1.5 million or something like that, which, you know, in a district like this, I mean, everybody talks about how big the budget is and so forth, but they need every dollar they can get. And so that kind of money is really significant.
Would you say that's more important than the denial of tenure?
I think the denial of tenure is extremely important. It's a big hurdle for
more important than these others.
I do.
I do too.
I do, because I just think it's a very significant thing for principals in particular to go through all of the education requirements, to go through all the demands of working in a school district like the city school district, and to not have some kind of reciprocal stability. It's an issue.
I have seen that a part of their evaluation is also based on test scores. I see the number 40% based on test scores. And he was quoted in one of these articles, I forget who wrote it, but it said he said, when I see the recommendations and I see the data, I'm more inclined to trust the data than the recommendations. Will either of you claim that source?
I think I might have.
Okay. And another complaint by the union is that the observations have been very spotty. Sometimes they would go years. Now, some of that is attributed to the fact that there was a turnover among the supervisors, Vargas' supervisors, and they weren't getting to all the people. And they were getting good reviews. They were getting sometimes the full 60 points, and yet they weren't granting tenure, or being given a year to improve and not being given any directions as to how you were supposed to improve. And the one story, I believe you wrote it, the woman said, I'm not accepting this. You give me a year to improve. I've gotten good evaluations. How do I improve? You're not giving me any direction. That's very difficult for someone to accept. You recall that part of the story. That's very compelling to a reader, such as myself. Does it boil down to personalities? Does it boil down to numbers, test scores?
I think that, again, we're back into this discussion about, you know, what Justin was talking about earlier in terms of how do you evaluate people in this kind of a system.
Yes.
It's an extremely complicated formula. I don't think anybody really understands it well. And no one, and I'm not even sure the question of understanding it is really the issue. It's the question of trust. There's a gap there in terms of trust, in terms of, and it goes all over the place. When this kind of pressure is being placed on all of these people, that trust kind of just dissolves. And I think that one of the things that happened with the principals as well that we didn't cover is that under the previous administration, they were encouraged to be kind of the CEOs of their own building. And so there was this idea that they were going to sort of have more freedom and more ability to try and do the things that they thought would correct.
Tim Maines was on this program before he left. That's one of the things.
He was one of the big proponents of this.
Yes.
And I think under Bohan, there's less of a desire to really do that. And if there is a willingness to do it, he brings with it the accountability factor, which kind of makes people a little uncomfortable. You know, saying, okay, if you want to do that, that's fine, but you're accountable for it.
And not only Dr. Vargas, but also the school board.
Right.
Van White he's sort of taken that into his influence. That I think every week or every month, he and some other people go to visit a school. They meet with the principal, and he has a pretty specific checklist of things that he wants to see and what progress is going to be made and how and when, and that to the extent that there's a power struggle going on at the very highest levels of the district, any given principal is now feeling like, well, I kind of have two bosses rather than the one that I was answering to before.
Absolutely, and let's pause here. We're done with our first segment. We're going to talk about that power struggle now between the Board of Education and the Superintendent of Schools. Don't go away, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We've been talking with Tim Macaluso of City Newspaper and Justin Murphy of the Democrat and Chronicle. We've been talking about School Superintendent Bolgen Vargas. In the first segment, we talked about his relationship with the teachers and with the administrators in the district. Now we're going to move on to his conflict with the Board of Education. Tim, the subheadline for your feature article says this: Superintendent Bolgen Vargas' contract with the Rochester School District ends June 30th, 2016. While it may seem premature to be thinking about it, the school board will need to have a serious discussion in the next few months about whether to renew that contract or start the search for a new superintendent. You then begin your article by saying this: it's hardly a secret that Vargas's relationship with some school board members is seriously strained. Both of you have written about this strain. Tim, what's the main cause, would you say?
You know, it's really hard to put your finger on the main cause. You have very strong-willed people. Bolgen he has a very strong personality. You have board members that have very strong personalities as well, and so there are some clashes in ideas, and there's some clashes in terms of, you know, one of the things that happens with, I've listened to board members talk about this frequently, is that they hire the superintendent, they're elected to hire a superintendent, they campaign on what they're going to be doing when they get in, if they get into being, take a seat on the board. And superintendents get hired by them, but when something goes wrong, when the superintendent, the graduation rates aren't right, or so-and-so has moved as a principal in school 9 and they liked that principal, they don't always call the superintendent. They might call the superintendent, but they'll also call the board. Mm-hmm. They might even call Lovely Warren, Mayor Warren. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, the responsibility is all over the place. And so, you know, that's kind of one of the, where some of the strain comes from, is because, you know, there's sometimes a little bit of an overlap about who is actually responsible, who's actually in charge, mm-hmm. and who's going to be held accountable. Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things you said in your article is that some of the tension has resulted from a sharp difference in opinion about the role of the school board and that of a superintendent,
right,
as
right.
It's written.
In this particular case, I think it really is, because you have the traditional view, and if you were to talk to somebody like, say, Jody Siegel, who's head of the Monroe County School Board, mm-hmm. Well, she's getting ready to retire, but the traditional view is that the board is responsible for the large oversight, for the hiring of the superintendent, for the budget, for approving that budget. But the implementation of policy, they set policy, but they don't implement the policy. Mm-hmm. But if you talk to board members, what they'll say is that, well, you know, yes, we have a very specific view of what we want that policy to look like when it's actually implemented. We don't just want to write a policy. And if you talk to, say, somebody like, say, President White, he has often said that one of the biggest criticisms of the board is that the board will say things publicly, but then, and the district will too, the school officials will say things publicly, but they won't follow through somewhere in the process, the implementation. And this is, I think, one of the biggest factors of all, is implementation is such an incredibly difficult thing to do. Mm-hmm. To do it right and to actually fully implement some of the things that they're charged with doing is really hard. Mm-hmm. And so when things fall down, that tends to be where they break. Mm. And so you have this board at this point, 4 members or 3 members at least, that are really sort of saying, you know, we want this done a specific way. We don't want to just, you know, we're not going to just stand back and just sort of see if it's implemented. It's almost like the graduation rate thing that we were talking about earlier. They want to see very specific progress on certain things, and I think that's a little difficult mm-hmm. for the superintendent.
Okay, Justin?
In sports, they often will point out that when a team's winning, you never happen to have any problems in the clubhouse. Whatever problems there might be kind of tend to get papered over if you just won the game. Mm-hmm. I think it's similar in schools. There might be some disputes out in a suburban school district, but if your graduation rate's at 95% year after year, then you can handle those kind of behind closed doors. they bubble up when there's a big problem. And if you have 30,000 students in your district and a lot of them or most of them are below the poverty line, then you're going to have plenty of problems bubbling up. So it comes from a good place. Van White or Malik Evans or any of the leaders of the school board, they're coming into it, they campaign and saying, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to make a difference. I'm not just going to kind of, vote yay or nay and sit back and watch things develop. I'm going to go and shake things up. And that's obviously the role that the superintendent has as well. He's the one who has the PhD in education administration, and he feels like that's his purview. So when they both see something happening wrong, some problem, they have both taken it upon themselves to charge in and implement their own vision for what it is. And in instances when those don't match, then it can get ugly.
When you were here the previous time, I made a statement. I said that I thought that the former school board president Malik Evans viewed himself as a facilitator. And you corrected me. You said you saw Malik Evans as a facilitator of Bolgen Vargas. I don't know if you remember saying that. It seems to me that Van White is definitely not that. He came in with his own set of ideas. He published them in a book that made it available to different people. He has an agenda of his own, not for his own self, but for the good of the community. He came in. He has a long history of activism in the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Strong personalities. I would say that Van Henri White, is the strongest of the personalities on that board.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So if they both have agendas, somebody's going to win. Somebody's going to lose. I don't see them compromising.
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting question, is whether or not there is going to be, compromise, whether there is, if you were to read some of the books on what makes a good school district or a good school board or a good, superintendent, one of the words that comes up frequently is synergy. That if you look at, say, and some people might not agree that the New York City School District under Bloomberg was a particularly effective administration, but one thing that they did seem to have, at least on the outward level, was the synergy between the CEO of the schools as well as Bloomberg, and I think that there is some synergy here. There is definitely, this board is actually much more effective than it has been in the past, or past boards rather. There is, there was just a dysfunction with previous boards that was just hard to put your arms around. But this board is actually, it's a working board. They are really very much involved in the day-to-day things. And now that's something that a lot of people would take an issue with. When you started with the question of Malik, and Malik would often say, that he started out trying to influence the vote and trying to, shepherd the vote, so to speak. And he pulled back from that, feeling that you really can't do that. You have to let people evolve. You have to let the vote evolve. And he often used the phrase that it takes 4 votes to do anything on the board. I think that Van is much more of a hands-on, this is what we need to do, we cannot let this happen, that kind of thing. And I think that sometimes some people are very fine with it, take that leadership, and other people don't.
And I think that an example of that in this case backfired for him was the busing contract that just happened. Van had decided that we're not going to be held hostage by RGRTA, we have other options, and he insisted on it, and there was some kind of nonsense going on with this company from out of town, and it was unclear whether they had submitted a proposal or not. And from what it seems like behind the scenes, it went from at least 3 votes in favor of this out-of-town company to 1 being Van White. And I think part of that is that there was a high-pressure sales pitch, and the timing was tight, and it just didn't go over very well.
Okay, let's look at this one episode that has to do with the superintendent's employment group, which is the personal staff of Bolgen Vargas. One of the things that he's tried to do is cut down the size of bureaucracy. He had originally 61 people, I believe, on his staff. He's now got it down to 31. And the board thought that was even too large. Am I characterizing that correctly?
I think the way Van says it is that it wasn't necessarily about the number of people or the specific people, but he said the procedure over the years somehow had deviated from state law. Now, that's what Van says, and that may be what Van believes, but it certainly didn't, that's not the way it looks, because it's been plenty public that there's some tension in cases between Van and the superintendent. Mm-hmm. And there's also, by the way, I think an interesting aspect of this is this plays right into the tension between ASAR, the superintendents, the administrators union, and Dr. Vargas, because mm-hmm. whoever's not in his private group, the superintendent's employment group, may very well be going into ASAR. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of a play for those people who are in the middle.
I see. And people who are in Bolgen Vargas's staff are not members of the union. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a power play. Who could possibly win in that? It seems like, could he possibly be reappointed if this is going on? That is Bolgen Vargas.
Well, Tim said it perfectly. It takes 4 votes to do whatever you want. And so you can only assume, I couldn't have imagined when this first happened, was it in March or April?
I think it was around April.
I couldn't have imagined that we would still be without a resolution this far down the road. But both sides appear to have settled on some sort of detente that they're going to let it happen. There's an election coming up in November. There will be at least one new board member. Mm-hmm. But you have to assume that if there were 4 votes of board members saying, I've had enough of Vargas for this or whatever reason, he would be out, because that's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a difficult precedent to set, too, because if they were to, I think, even the busing, there are people who definitely were not happy with the busing situation beyond Van, but you take a big risk. This was happening 2 weeks ago. That's still less than 8 weeks before school starts. Now the service in that was the other service that the Van was speaking about was making promises that they could step right in and not have a problem.
Never having set foot in the city of Rochester in their lives.
Yeah, you can understand why some of the board members were probably questioning, should this be what we do right now, and back away from it. And the same thing is true with the superintendent in terms of his contract. I mean, to end his contract would require buying him out. Mm-hmm. It would be costly. Mm-hmm. The district just seems to have these disruptions now and then. Mm-hmm. Not now and then, but somewhat more than now and then.
Okay, we're about out of time.
Okay.
So, what percentage do you think of him getting a second term? Quick, off the top of your head. 50-50?
60.
60% that he comes back?
Yeah.
I would say less than that.
Less than 60, less than 50?
Possibly.
Possibly. Well, we'll see. He has a number of things on his plate. We've got East High coming up as a major experiment. We have a number of school closings that if he still remains the principal, he's going to be in charge of, and that's going to create a lot of discussion, shall we say. Well, I want to thank my guests, Tim Macaluso.
Thank you.
Justin Murphy.
My pleasure.
Let's talk again sometime. I enjoyed this very much. Okay, thank you for watching Spotlight on Schools. Join us next time. Thank you for watching.